On the 23rd of November 2006, a former Russian spy, now working for the British MI6, died in hospital. His cause of death, confirmed only hours before, was found to be a deadly radioactive material. Whilst in hospital, as he lay dying, he was adamant that he had been poisoned. Images of Alexander Litvinenko shocked the world and raised the question, why and how was he poisoned? In today's video, we will look at the assassination of Alexander. It's perhaps helpful to start with an explanation as to who Alexander was and why he turned from a Russian FSB agent to an MI6 asset. Alexander was born on the 30th of August 1960 in the Russian city of Voronezh in the Soviet Union. After leaving school, he joined the Soviet Union's Ministry of Internal Affairs as a private. By 1985, he had risen to the rank of platoon commander. In 1986, he became an informant, recruited by the KGB counterintelligence section. In 1991, he joined the Federal Counterintelligence Service, the precursor for the SFB, specializing in counter-terrorism. He oversaw deployment of intelligence agents in Chechnya and the infiltration of agents to organized crime networks in Russia. In 1994, he met a Russian oligarch by the name of Boris Berezovsky. Alexander was investigating an assassination attempt on Berezovsky. Shortly after, he was employed by Berezovsky to oversee his security, all while still working with the state security services too. During his time with the FSB, Alexander worked to combat the Russian mafia and its connections to state law enforcement. In 1998, Berezovsky arranged a meeting between Alexander and the newly appointed head of the FSB, Vladimir Putin, a man whose rise to that position Berezovsky himself had helped enable. Alexander was, at the time, investigating FSB bosses who were taking money from Uzbek drug dealers. Putin wasn't impressed. He saw Alexander as overly aggressive and as someone who could expose corruption inside the FSB, hurting its reputation. The meeting only lasted 10 minutes, and Alexander was suspended shortly afterwards. In November of 1998, after becoming frustrated, Alexander went public with his allegations that he was being roped into an FSB plot to assassinate Berezovsky, who had fallen out of favor with the regime. Alexander and 4 other members of the FSB held a press conference where they detailed the FSB's plot to kidnap and murder a number of Russian politicians and businessmen. Following this, Alexander was in and out of prison, facing corruption charges. In March of 1999, he was arrested and detained for 8 months in the FSB remand prison on the charge of having abused official authority. In November of 1999, he was acquitted at court and then immediately rearrested on new similar charges. In September of 2000, he managed to flee Russia, seeking asylum in the UK. His political asylum was granted on the 14th of May 2001 on apparent humanitarian grounds. While in London, he worked as a security consultant, associating with other Russian exiles and critics of the Russian government, which was now led by Vladimir Putin. Alexander would continue his criticism of Putin and the FSB from London, notably in his co-authoring of the book Blowing Up Russia, Terror from Within in 2002. One of the key accusations leveled against the FSB was that they were responsible for the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999. In these attacks, over 300 people were killed and over 1,000 injured. These attacks were blamed on Chechen separatists and were used as a justification for the second invasion of Chechnya. Vladimir Putin's handling of the crisis saw an increase in his popularity to levels allowing him to become president only a few months later. Alexander asserted that the FSB was behind the attacks to create a false flag operation and justify another invasion. In 2003, Alexander was recruited by MI6, apparently working as a paid consultant. He would advise British police on matters dealing with the Russian mafia and their operations in Spain. In addition, Alexander worked as a private security advisor, which involved preparing due diligence for reports for British companies looking to find out information about their Russian business contacts. During this time in London, he was seen as a traitor and subjected to numerous death threats. But he continued to reveal or report on potentially damaging or embarrassing acts by the Russian state. He alleged that the FSB had allowed the Beslan school siege to go ahead, and that they were well aware of the Chechnyan plot to kidnap hundreds of children. All of this as a pretense for further power being granted in the name of counter-terrorism by the Russian state. In 2006, Alexander accused Putin of being a PDF file. and that the FSB had documented proof of him and young boys. In 2006, he accused Putin of being behind the assassination of a Russian journalist and human rights activist by the name of Anna Politkovskaya. Anna had been shot dead in her apartment on the 7th of October, which just so happens to be Putin's birthday. She was a very vocal critic of Putin, and in particular, the damage being done in Chechnya. During the Beslan school siege, she had been scheduled to act as a negotiator for the release of hostages, but before she could make it, she fell ill and unconscious after being given a cup of tea. In 2006, 2 weeks after Alexander's accusations that Putin had ordered Anna's death, he met up with two former KGB agents, Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy. They met on the 1st of November 2006, and the purpose of the meeting was of the sort of business that Alexander was engaged in at the time. They met at the upmarket Millennium Hotel in Mayfair, London, having drinks at the hotel's Pine Bar. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary meeting. However, in the early hours of the 2nd of November 2006, Alexander started to violently vomit. He had extremely bad abdominal pain and was passing bloody diarrhea. On the 3rd of November, he went to the hospital, where he was initially treated for suspected gastroenteritis. Tests showed dangerously low white blood cell counts, indicating bone marrow failure. His liver was the first to fail, then his kidney, then his heart. He lost his hair and remained bedbound for his stay in hospital, growing ever weaker. On the 17th of November, Alexander was transferred to the University College Hospital to see whether a bone marrow transplant was feasible. Doctors were baffled as to the cause, but Alexander was adamant. He believed he had been poisoned by the Russian state. Police, scientists from the Ministry of Defense, and intelligence officers soon began interviewing Alexander about his suspicions. On the 21st of November 2006, his blood was tested at the Aldermaston Atomic Weapons Establishment, the site responsible for Britain's nuclear weapons research. Blood tests revealed a particular radioactive isotope in his bloodstream, polonium-210, a material used in the manufacturing of nuclear weapons. Then, on the 23rd of November 2006, Alexander passed away after suffering a cardiac arrest, along with multiple organ failure. Before his death, he gave an impassioned call against Putin, stating, quote, "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protests from around the world, Mr. Putin, will reverberate in the ears for the rest of your life." The following day, Putin publicly declared, "Mr. Litvinenko is unfortunately not Lazarus." On the 7th of December 2006, Alexander was buried within a lead-lined casket at Highgate Cemetery. His body was so radioactive that his hospital room had to be sealed and decontaminated, and the staff who treated him had to be tested. The response from the British government was to find those responsible and to ascertain whether or not there was a risk of members of the public becoming exposed to the deadly radiation. Alexander, on his deathbed, had detailed the meeting with the former KGB agents, Kovtun and Lugovoy. These two now became the top suspects, and the search started there. High levels of contamination were found in the hotel, particularly in the bathroom. The trail was then followed to other hotels in London. Over 40 different sites were found to have been contaminated, including the London Underground. Much of this information was kept out of the public's knowledge to avoid any mass panic of radioactive contamination. Kovtun and Lugovoy's movements in London matched perfectly to the sites of contamination discovered by detectives and scientists. The polonium-210 was also believed to have originated in Russia. It is an extremely dangerous material, and it's strictly controlled by governments and state bodies. Access to this material would therefore need to come with some form of state sanction. In the years that followed, further investigations into the assassination revealed further clues about just how Alexander had been murdered. Tests at the hotel revealed a teapot with exceedingly high levels of polonium-210. Evidence indicated that the material had entered Alexander by ingestion in the form of a soluble compound. It's believed that Alexander's tea was poisoned by Lugovoy and Kovtun ahead of Alexander arriving, left waiting on the table for him on arrival, although it does seem that they might not have known exactly what they were giving him. Their handling of the material, and the fact that Lugovoy allowed his son to shake Alexander's hand, would indicate that they were oblivious to the risks. In Lugovoy's hotel room, polonium-210 was discovered in the U-bend of the sink in the room he stayed in. This level of contamination would indicate that the radioactive material had been poured down the sink. There was also evidence that the material had been spilled on the floor and cleaned up with hotel towels, which all still showed traces of contamination. Kovtun would also be investigated by German police, who found traces of polonium in his flat in Hamburg. In December of 2006, Kovtun was hospitalized in Russia, some believing for an illness caused by the mishandling of the polonium-210. He has always denied involvement in the killing of Alexander, and attempts to extradite him have failed. Attempts to extradite Lugovoy also failed, and calls for his arrest went unheard. In 2007, he became a member of Russia's parliament, thus granting him immunity from prosecution. Lugovoy would also go on to receive a medal for his service to the fatherland in 2015. He remains deputy in the Russian parliament to this day. Lugovoy would deny his involvement in the murder, instead trying to lay the blame on Berezovsky, who was at the time exiled from Russia and living in the UK. Berezovsky would die in 2013, although there are some who believe that this was an assassination. It's been suggested, including by Alexander himself whilst in hospital, that the assassination of such a high-profile former SFB officer would not have been approved lightly. Many suspect that the orders for the assassination came directly from Vladimir Putin himself. An inquiry into the murder, led by Sir Robert Owen, would begin in 2011 and published its findings in 2016. It laid the blame squarely on Kovtun and Lugovoy, and claimed that they were acting on behalf of the Russian FSB, probably approved by Putin. In 2007, Alexander's wife would take her husband's murder to the European Court of Human Rights, bringing charges against the Russian state for violating her husband's right to life. The court ruled in her favour that Kovtun and Lugovoy had acted on behalf of the Russian state and had agreed with the British inquiry as to what had actually happened. They awarded Alexander's wife with €100,000 in compensation, but Russia has refused to accept the verdict of the court. The case of Alexander shocked the UK. It sounds more like a Cold War spy thriller than real life. And the shocking images of a man slowly dying from radiation poisoning remain etched into many people's minds. And he wouldn't be the last victim of Russian agents on British soil. In 2018, nerve agents were used against Sergei Skripal, a double agent living in Salisbury. A week later, exiled Russian businessman Nikolai Glushkov was found dead. Coroners ruled his death as an unlawful killing with injuries that, quote, could be consistent with a neck hold applied from behind and the assailant being behind the victim. These cases are a disturbing reminder of the reach and threat posed by those willing to squash dissent or criticism, regardless of the cost.